Through the years, many Texans have made history, though some far less remembered or memorialized. Today, a few of those stories brought to life on a special edition of The Standard.
Texas Standard is a production of KUT Austin, KERA North Texas, Houston Public Media, and Texas Public Radio in San Antonio.
I'm David Brown. You don't have to be an historian to know why the words Apollo 11 mean so much to so many. The moonshot heard round the world would transform Texas, though the space explorers who'd follow would get far less attention. Something similar can be said for the Texas farm workers, whose work transformed the landscape for laborers in the Lone Star State, though others often get the lion's share of the credit. A bit of history reconsidered on today's special edition of the Texas Standard. And our program gets started right after this. No matter where you are, it's Texas Standard Time on this Thursday, December 26th, 2024. I'm David Brown. Great to have you with us. In the not-so-distant past, a promise to put an American on the moon set into motion a series of events that would not only transform Texas, but become a touchstone for a generation. Many of us remember holding our breath as we heard the voices of astronauts slowly approaching the lunar surface. And then those words from Mission Commander Neil Armstrong, "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." As years went by, public interest in space waned a bit, but space history continued to be made nonetheless, a history less talked about perhaps, and often overlooked today. Atlantis, Discovery, Enterprise, Endeavour, Challenger, Columbia. For 3 decades, NASA was in the Space Shuttle age, with 135 missions. Most were filled with historic firsts, and there were also tragedies. Astronaut and spacewalker Tom Jones collected stories from each mission in a big photo-filled book titled Space Shuttle Stories. He joined us in January. Of course, a lot of folks in Space City, in that area around the Johnson Space Center, very busy these days. But I think when most people think of NASA, they might think of its zenith as the Apollo era, putting people on the moon by the end of the 60s. But your affection for the Space Shuttle comes from firsthand experience. Tell us a little bit about your 4 flights. What were you doing on the Space Shuttle?
I was very lucky to get to fly on 4 shuttle missions during the 1990s into the early 2000s. And so 3 of them, the first 3 were science missions. And that's so much of what the shuttle did during the 1990s. It was a science platform helping us get ready for the space station program. And so 2 of them were Earth science missions, where we studied the changing face of our dynamic planet. And the third one was a launch of 2 science satellites that did some astronomy, and the other one did computer chip manufacturing in space. Then we retrieved those satellites and brought them back home for reuse. And then finally, on my 4th trip, it was a construction hard hat flight where we went up and helped build the space station by delivering the U.S. science lab called Destiny up there to the station.
Well, that speaks to the versatility of the shuttle, obviously. But could you say a little bit more about what was so special about this particular space shuttle era for NASA? What did it signify?
Right. It came after the Apollo moon landings. The first flight was in 1981, and then the shuttle served the nation for 30 years until 2011. And it was the most long-lived program in NASA's history, and I would argue that it was the most important program, even considering Apollo, because in those 30 years, we learned how to work and do complex operations in space that are going to be the foundation for what we do here in the 21st century. So the shuttle was a very versatile, flexible platform. It did military and classified missions to help us during the Cold War. It did satellite deployment and repair. It flew mini science laboratories to get us ready for the space station, and it repaired and upgraded the Hubble telescope, for example. 355 people flew on the space shuttle.
What did folks tell you about how their experience with the shuttle program changed their lives?
Well, there's the physical experience, first of all. And so everybody's awestruck by the view of the home planet from 200 miles up, let's say. And so there's that experience of seeing your home as an oasis in space. And it's a wonder that we ever got any work done up there because of the draw of the beauty of the planet outside. And then there's the physical experience of living and working in space. You're on a camping trip where you happen to be weightless at the same time, and you're trying to deal with everything that you have to deal with in living and working in a laboratory up there. So the space shuttle was essentially an orbiting laboratory type of environment, but you still had a bathroom, you had a kitchen, you had exercise gear and sleeping quarters. All of that rolled into these two minivan-sized spaces that made up the shuttle's crew cabin. I think the overwhelming impression that was in common with our crewmates and colleagues was that we felt an immense satisfaction in being part of the team that pulled off all these amazing and different missions. So you were part of the mission control team in Houston. You were part of the launch control team in Florida, getting you into orbit, preparing your spaceship for flight. And then while you were in space, you were the in-space part of that team that actually, did the actual rendezvous and grapple of satellites, or built the space station, or operated an observatory up there.
As young people study the space program, there's a little intermission sort of between, I say intermission, that's not the right word, but there's the Apollo project, and then, of course, you have the Space Shuttle, but there was an interim there where there was a lot of excitement around Skylab. And my sense was that, in a way, the Space Shuttle picked up on what the promise of Skylab was. Is that accurate? What happened there? And why did we end up in the Space Shuttle era to begin with?
Skylab used the leftovers from the Apollo program to actually put a little space station in orbit. And it was roomy enough. It was about the size of a 2-bedroom house. 3 astronauts lived in it for as long as 84 days. Mm-hmm. And so it was up there and being used by 3 different crews for about a year and a half in the early 1970s. And it gave us a taste of what the resources of near-Earth space and low-Earth orbit would do for us. We had the vacuum that we could tap into. We had the clear skies above the atmosphere. And we had the resource of free fall or weightlessness to use as a laboratory factor in our investigations. So to utilize those resources more fully and routinely and regularly, the Space Shuttle was conceived as a way to get you to low Earth orbit, give you 2 to 3 weeks of working time up there. And you could carry a laboratory with you, or you could deploy a science satellite, or you could launch a commercial satellite. So the 30 years of the shuttle program gave us the skills and the experience we needed to tackle everything we could do in near-Earth space.
Well, now, I want to ask about something that I think a lot of Texans in particular remember, of course, the Columbia disaster. Can you talk about writing about that mission and the Challenger disaster, too?
Yeah, the shuttle flew for 30 years, and it had 2 tragic accidents. In 1986, Challenger was lost during ascent to orbit. And then in 2003, Columbia was lost on the way back from its 16-day science mission. And so I was trying in my book to get one astronaut voice from every one of the 135 missions. And now I've got 2 missions that I have to tell the story of without any crewmates of mine to help me tell that story. They're gone. I had to search for their voices. And in the 1980s, NASA didn't do a lot of recording of press conferences and long format interviews. So I had to go to press clippings, media interviews by TV stations talking to people. And then in the case of Columbia, the 7 astronauts aboard that ship were all of my friends and coworkers. We worked on the space station planning and training together. I could have done the same thing and gone to snippets from each of them, but my friend Laurel Clark, who was on Columbia, sent an email home just a couple of days before the crew returned, and that's when their heat shield failed and they were lost. And her email was just so full of the awe of being in space for the first time. She was a rookie flyer. And just the enthusiasm and teamwork and friendship that came through her email was so vivid and told the story so well that I let Laurel, with her email, speak for the entire Columbia crew in the book.
Given that some of these disasters were such moments, really, in American history and world history, I wonder if, in a sense, the achievements don't get the sort of attention that they would have otherwise. Do you think that that's fair to say? I mean, that in a way, the disasters, the Columbia, the Challenger disaster, sort of overshadowed the accomplishments in a sense?
I would agree. Those 2 tragedies are seared into our memories. We all remember where we were when these 2 accidents occurred. And so you tend to lose the content of the other 133 missions. But what comes across in the book, I think, is that everybody had a unique job to do, a set of mission objectives that they were so enthusiastic about. And they were so successful, by and large, in getting these things done. And it's inconceivable to me that we could just jump from Apollo to going back to the moon or onto Mars without this big intermediate step of the shuttle teaching us how to work successfully on complex operations in space. Some miracles were pulled off in repairing and restoring the Hubble and building the space station that really just still amaze me.
Tom, your enthusiasm is infectious, and I'm wondering what it was that sort of drove you to want to write this book in the first place, as you present it too. I mean, this is a very human book for something that we often think of as very scientific. There's something about this. There's a sense of urgency, perhaps, maybe seeing all of these stories gathered together. Do you know what I mean?
I think I understand. My motivation was to get the human voice of the astronauts out there. The shuttle's receding into history, and it's been over 12 years since it retired. And so I wanted to capture these human experiences before the participants, the astronauts themselves, have left us. And in the case of the flyers from the early 1980s, many of them have gone on to posterity. So I wanted to first start with those early missions and get a voice before I lost some crew members, and then proceed all the way through the 135 missions and get a single voice. And my motivation was to add to the technical histories that NASA and other authors have produced about the shuttle's career, and then preserve those lessons learned in the experiences of the astronauts so that future explorers can benefit from those lessons and fears and challenges overcome by the shuttle astronauts.
Tom, I have to ask, I don't know what age you are, but I'm curious, did you grow up at a time when there was all this excitement about space exploration, young people wanting to grow up and become astronauts someday? Was that you?
I'm a child of the space age. So I grew up at the heart of the Gemini and Apollo programs, and I was going to high school when we first landed humans on the moon. So I was motivated to become an astronaut, or to try to get to be one someday, by my heroes in the Apollo program. And so it was a lifelong dream of mine. It only took me 29 years to get qualified and hired as an astronaut, but I finally got there, and I was privileged to get to work with some of the Apollo astronauts who served as my instructors when I was a shuttle crew member.
What a ride. Tom Jones is an astronaut and the author of the book Space Shuttle Stories, first-hand astronaut accounts from all 135 missions. Tom, thanks again.
You're welcome.
From an often overlooked chapter in the history of space exploration to another history much closer to home, a story seldom told about the Texas farm workers fighting for historic changes. That and more as this special edition of the Texas Standard continues. Stay with us.
Support for Texas Standard comes from Raise Your Hand Texas, working to strengthen public education for all students and helping Texans understand education issues, coming up during the 89th legislative session at raiseyourhandtexas.org.
It's the Texas Standard. I'm David Brown. The name César Chávez and the United Farm Workers loom large when talking about the struggle of farm workers and Latino civil rights. But you may not have heard of another group that split off from Chavez and the UFW, one that did a lot of work to draw attention to the plight of farm workers in Texas. In October, the Texas Standard's Raul Alonso reported a three-part series on a little-known chapter in this history, the story of the Texas Farm Workers Union.
Most histories of the United Farm Workers founding will mention, of course, César Chávez and Dolores Huerta. Occasionally, you'll see Gilberto Badia's name, and then maybe sometimes you'll see a quote and others. But then if you look long enough, you might start catching glimpses of the man some have called the César Chávez of Texas.
When the union was founded, it was César Chávez, Dolores Huerta, Gilberto Padilla, and my dad, Antonio Orendain.
That's Joseph Orendain, an assistant district attorney for Hidalgo County. He's also the youngest son of Antonio Orendain, the original secretary-treasurer of the National Farm Workers Association, the organization that later became the UFW.
And in fact, there's an old photo that they can't get rid of, and on the traveling exhibits, you see it, and they have him as Tony Orendain as one of the founding members.
But at some point, a fracture formed, and Antonio Orendain split from Chavez and the UFW, focusing instead on organizing farm workers in Texas's lower Rio Grande Valley. In 1975, Orendain and those who followed him from the UFW formed a new group.
Robin, they call themselves the Texas Farm Workers Union, but it's a union without much portfolio. The AFL-CIO is not supporting them. Neither is César Chávez and his California Farm Workers Union.
Joseph Orendain says his father's early contributions have been largely written out of the official narrative.
Anything authorized by the UFW, you could not mention my dad.
His father, in fact, was originally included in the 2014 César Chávez biopic, but the part was ultimately cut. Still, if you search, you can find recordings of actor Gino Montesinos' audition for the role on YouTube. It's a glimpse into the way Orendain was to be portrayed as a foil to Chávez's famous principles of nonviolence.
Madre César, ese hijo de gonna pay right here, right now. Sácamelo!
The first person who lays a hand on him is out of the union.
You and your stupid nonviolence. Esto es de Delano. This is about Delano. This is about being a man.
While the part was cut, a version of the scene still appears in the film, but with a different character named Eli, whose wide-brimmed black hat and handlebar mustache nonetheless evoke the iconic physical image Orendain became known for.
What are you doing, César? Leave him alone! This son of a needs to pay right here, right now. No.
If you watch that movie, you'll see, and they're accusing him of being the radical, violent one. And, they portray it that way, but my dad was nonviolent and believed in all of the same things as Chavez.
So what was it that led to a split between Orendain and Chavez?
I think there were always personality differences and always ego clashes that could potentially develop between the two.
That's Timothy Bowman, a professor of history at West Texas A&M University. He's also the author of what will soon be the first ever book-length historical treatment of the Texas Farm Workers Union. As it stands, his master's thesis remains one of the only academic overviews of that history. Bowman says the stark differences between Chavez and Orendain had persisted for some time. For one, Orendain had entered the U.S. and settled in California as an undocumented immigrant when he was younger. He later saw organizing those with similar stories as part of his strategy. On the other hand, Chavez has been criticized by some for policies the UFW engaged in against undocumented workers. Chavez also cultivated a very spiritual persona, embracing Catholic imagery and engaging in fasts as part of his strategy of nonviolence. Orendain was very much a secularist and often voiced his opposition to Chavez's fasts.
He very much has this kind of revolutionary sort of aesthetic about him that I think resonated with a lot of people in the valley who were really poor.
But perhaps the main sticking point centered around the lack of progress Orendain felt the UFW had made in organizing workers in Texas. In 1966, the UFW became embroiled in a wildcat strike among melon harvesters in Starr County. Bowman says it wasn't a struggle Chavez really wanted to be part of, but was compelled to, due to the role his Texas grape boycott director had taken in organizing the strike.
Chavez starts to worry that if this movement in the valley, or this sort of branch of the farm workers movement, doesn't go well, that then will lead to problems for him.
So Chavez sent his trusted secretary-treasurer, Antonio Orendain, to oversee the strike. Orendain quickly made a name for himself in Texas. He staged sit-ins on the International Bridge in Roma, organized boycotts, and even found himself and the farm workers accused of sabotage in an incident that led to tense encounters with the Texas Rangers. It was amid this struggle that Orendain grew to feel at home among the Texas farm workers.
It's almost like it becomes his own separate kind of dedicated area where he feels a sort of a calling or a sense of purpose to do something.
It's through this dedication that Orendain begins to grow frustrated with what he sees as a lack of interest from Chavez to put some of the focus of the UFW onto Texas. After the strike, Chavez recalled Orendain back to California, but not for long. Instead, Orendain moved his family to the Rio Grande Valley and continued organizing workers there under the UFW banner. He oversaw the construction of an office in San Juan and started a popular cross-border radio show called La Voz del Campesino.
Así hemos dado principio a otro programa de La Voz del Campesino con su servidor Antonio Orendain y el propósito de informarle qué es lo que la Unión de Trabajadores del Campo está tratando de hacer en el Valle de Texas.
Bowman says Orendain saw his efforts in Texas as laying the foundation for Chavez to bring the movement there. But while Chavez had said the UFW would eventually turn its focus to Texas, Orendain began growing impatient. By the 1970s, the lettuce strike in California held the focus of the UFW. But over in Texas, farm workers became embroiled in a new melon strike. It's in this strike, in the spring of 1975, that a breaking point came, when a grower opened fire on picketing farm workers near Hidalgo, injuring close to a dozen.
Chavez is just incensed with what's going on in Texas. He calls Orendain up and says, how can you do this? This is terrible for us. I can't have this in the union, da-da-da-da-da. And then by August of that year, Orendain splits off and forms the Texas Farm Workers Union, and then the rift becomes official.
Many, but not all, of the Texas UFW members followed Orendain into the new union. While the TFWU operation was small, it launched big campaigns in the Lone Star State. But it's a history that's largely been overlooked, and Orendain's son feels it's partly by design.
We've never really had anything against the UFW other than them leaving my dad out of the history books, out of the fact that he was and deserved acknowledgement for what he did.
There are no feature films about the Texas Farm Workers Union. Even in Texas, there are no murals or historical markers describing the union. But while difficult to find, there are those who keep the history alive. I spoke to a few of them. And next time, I'll share some of their stories. Until then, I'm Raul Alonso for the Texas Standard.
Support for Coverage of Business comes from Texas Mutual Insurance Company, a workers' comp carrier dedicated to handling claims proactively to help injured employees get back on the job and policyholders get back to business. More at texasmutual.com/claims.
From the Texas Newsroom, I'm Matt Harrop. A new report shows Texas is facing a long-term deficit with its water supply. KUT's Kaylee Hunt explains how a policy expert wants to solve this issue.
The new report from Rice University's Baker Institute suggests that a prolonged severe drought like that of the 1950s or 2011 could cost the state's economy hundreds of billions of dollars. That's because industries like agriculture, manufacturing, and energy production heavily rely upon water availability. Jeremy Mazer is with Texas 2036, an Austin-based public policy organization.
If we don't have reliable water infrastructure, then we likely cannot have the continuation of the Texas economic miracle.
He's recommending lawmakers create a lasting revenue stream similar to what is currently done for parks and state highways. I'm Kaylee Hunt in Austin.
The Houston Police Department has almost closed the book on the suspended cases scandal. It's reviewed 97% of the more than 260,000 cases that were improperly closed over an 8-year period due to a, quote, lack of personnel. The review doesn't mean justice has been served. 68% of those cases were resuspended. But HPD Union President Douglas Griffith says they were properly investigated this time.
That's the difference between what was taking place and what we are doing now, which is we take every single lead and we run it down on a person-to-person crime. Rape, robbery, aggravated assault, family violence. Every single one of those cases have leads of some way, shape, or form, and we're going to investigate those until we run out.
The department expects to complete its review by the end of the month. Many of the bills filed ahead of the next month's legislative session center on child welfare. Texas Public Radio's Paul Flav reports.
More than 70 bills have been filed so far dealing with the Department of Family and Protective Services. DFPS does the lion's share of work related to child welfare in Texas, investigating abuse and neglect, as well as working with vendors to provide services. Bills vary in scope, to starting rural pilot programs to deliver services better, to those that restrict when a child can be removed from a family member. One bill from San Antonio legislators Senator Jose Menendez and Representative John Lujan seek to expand tuition assistance and exemption for children who were previously in the state's foster care system. The legislative session begins January 14th. I'm Paul Flav in San Antonio.
And 7 Texans are among nearly 40 inmates who had their federal death sentences commuted to life in prison by President Biden earlier this week. The inmates will serve their sentences without the possibility of parole. I'm Matt Harrop in the Texas Newsroom.
You're listening to statewide news from public radio stations across Texas. This coverage is only possible because of support from listeners like you. You can help sustain and grow Texas news coverage by donating to your local public radio station today.
You're listening to a special edition of the Texas Standard. I'm David Brown. In the years that it was active, the Texas Farmworkers Union sought to turn the eyes of the nation towards the plight of agricultural laborers using a variety of tactics. In this second installment of a 3-part series, Texas Standard digital producer Raul Alonso spoke with some of those who were there in the mid-1970s for one of the union's most ambitious undertakings.
Then this is when we got there to D.C.
I'm standing in the hallway of the far Texas home of Norma Ramirez, listening intently as she shows me the many photos that adorn her walls.
I like this picture because you can see the Capitol.
Some are in black and white, some in sepia-tinged shades of color that show their age. They all depict people holding signs or carrying flags and banners while on a march or walking a picket line.
Did you put all these up for this, or
no,
do you usually
I have them. This is my little hall. Like, I have them.
In several of the photos is an older mustached man wearing dark, square-framed glasses and a straw hat. He holds a large banner with the iconic Virgen de San Juan, a rosary draped over it. The man is Don Claudio Ramirez, Norma's father. He was something of the standard bearer for the Texas Farmworkers Union.
We were migrant workers, so my family, most of them, they're not educated. When he crossed over here, he crossed illegal. Eventually, he became a citizen, a U.S. citizen, but he was always a farm worker.
The Texas Farmworkers Union was only around for a few short years, but in that time, members held strikes, pushed legislative campaigns, and took on community work in the Rio Grande Valley. And while those who were part of it have won some appreciation for the work, both the name of the Texas Farmworkers Union and those who were part of it remain largely outside the popular consciousness. Their photos, artifacts, and stories live on not in the pages of school books or in the permanent collections of museums, but here, in the homes and memories of people like Norma Ramirez.
They mean a lot to me.
A centerpiece of Norma's photo collection is a poster-sized image showing her father with his banner marching alongside Union leader Antonio Orendain, the U.S. Capitol dome seen behind them. This was the endpoint of one of the monumental moments in the Union's history, one that began in 1977 with a march from the Valley to the state capitol in Austin.
Del Valle del Rio Grande del pueblito de San Juan se juntaron campesinos para empezar a marchar.
It was 38 days ago, 9 a.m., February 26, when they began down here in the tip of the Rio Grande Valley of Texas in the town of San Juan. They marched northward to Corpus Christi on the Gulf, and then to San Antonio, and finally to Austin, the state capital.
The Union started the march to support a bill they had pushed for. It contained many of the provisions the TFWU had sought, chief among them the creation of a state agricultural labor relations board, similar to the one won by Chavez and the UFW in California. The Texas Union hoped to gain an audience with Governor Dolph Briscoe and present him with a petition of 500,000 signatures in support of the bill. Aurora Gomez remembers when the marchers passed through Robstown, a small community right outside Corpus Christi.
They actually stayed, they came to our house, at my mom's house. We fed everybody.
Her family had long been farm workers, and Aurora says her father, future Justice of the Peace, Lorenzo Rojas, was eager to help.
He didn't want them to stay in the street, and Antonio Arendine said, no, we have to stay in the street. That's part of the march. It's like when you make a promesa that you're going to go see the Virgin and you go in your knees. That's what they were doing. They were camping out in the streets.
Aurora, then 13, joined her father on the march the rest of the way to Austin.
Que viva el chicanismo y que viva mi raza, sí señor.
On Sunday, after a mass and then an ecumenical church service, the original marchers were joined by other supporters for a pre-march rally. There were nearly 1,000 in the group when they headed north up Congress Avenue for the final 3 miles to the state capitol.
Governor Briscoe met with them, but would not commit to supporting the bill. The marchers remained in Austin, telling lawmakers why they felt the legislation was necessary. When passage looked unlikely, the marchers began to think bigger. Here's Joseph Arendine, Antonio's son, who was with the marchers.
They all started kind of joking around, like, if the governor doesn't listen to us, well, then let's take it to the president. Let's just keep the march going.
The union resolved to march again, and this time to take their petition to the steps of the White House to try and get an audience with President Jimmy Carter.
We had a meeting with the people that were committed to walk, and for 3 hours I made arguments about why not to do it.
Here's Alfredo de Avila, who is the organizing director for the Texas Farm Workers Union.
It was going to be a long-ass march, and it was going to be extremely difficult. And our members voted that since Carter had come to the Valley, which he did, he said the White House was going to be open and be receptive and hear from the voices of all. And they took him for his word.
We'll follow their journey from Austin to D.C. when the Texas Standard continues. It's the Texas Standard. I'm Raul Alonso. On June 18, 1977, about 45 marchers with the Texas Farm Workers Union set out from Austin on a 1,600-mile route to the nation's capital. At the head of the march, Don Claudio took his familiar spot, carrying the TFWU banner. Running ahead of the march and passing out copies of the union's paper was Julio Coreño. The Mexico-born Coreño was known for being an openly gay man in a time and setting when it was still rare. But perhaps what he was most regarded for was the speed at which he moved ahead of the march, wearing just his huaraches, or even barefoot. It was a trait that inspired artist Luis Guerra, who joined the farm workers on a stretch of the march.
When we went through Lake Charles, he was running back and forth on both sides of the street. And so he was walking 3 or 4 times what everybody else was because he was running back and forth all over the place.
Coreño became one of the farm workers Guerra included in a silkscreen he entitled Hasta la Gloria. But while the print only shows the faces of 5 people, Guerra says there were many others that inspired him throughout the stretch of the march he took part in.
When you look at it, there's somebody coming in from the back, just entering the poster, and there's people sort of stepping out of it in the front. And that was my way of saying there's a lot more people,
The route brought the marchers far from home. Joseph Arendine celebrated his 14th birthday en route to D.C. He says the 20 miles a day the marchers aimed for was difficult, though as the union got out of Texas, they encountered more people willing to help them.
Once we hit Louisiana, we started the church groups, the Lions Clubs, the halls. We started staying at halls that actually had showers in places, or people would invite us to their homes to go shower.
We've got people here from all over the state of Mississippi, as far away as Cleveland, Mississippi.
All across the South, the marchers met with supporters and civil rights leaders, like Coretta Scott King. Stopping in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, local organizers highlighted their solidarity with the marchers' struggle.
We may not march all the way to Washington with you all, but you have our complete support.
They also talked about the impact the TFWU had in their own communities.
When the farm workers left Texas on June 18th, we celebrated Juneteenth in Mobile, Alabama with a festival in support of the Texas farm workers. And I might say that this is the first. This is the first time that Juneteenth has ever been celebrated in the state of Alabama.
Aurora Gomez and her family didn't follow the route out of Austin, but they did catch up with the marchers as they neared D.C.
It's like when the people say, oh, I went to Woodstock, and I got over there and I met the Beatles, and well, this is my Beatles. This is mine, because I was there, I lived it.
And almost like Woodstock, Aurora met a musical hero when Esteban Jordan, who composed songs supporting the farm workers, greeted marchers there at the Capitol.
And he was singing the song de los campesinos, and then he made up the other one, que siguieron los campesinos. It was awesome. I mean, something that I'll never forget. Never.
After several long months, the marchers entered Washington, D.C. on September 6th, welcomed by supporters and news cameras. But while Orendain had one meeting with Labor Secretary Ray Marshall, a meeting with President Carter eluded him. He and a few other marchers started a water-only fast and maintained a 24-hour-a-day vigil outside the White House. 10 days after they arrived in D.C., the marchers still had not been granted a meeting with Carter. But the administration offered one with the vice president.
They kept saying no. So we did the fast. Then afterward, they decided they wanted to shut us up, so they offered us a meeting with Mondale. And that's when Mondale said, we're willing to work on this thing. We're going to turn around and we'll deal with this issue the next time around.
But while that assurance from Mondale seemed hopeful, history did not unfold in a favorable way for the marchers. The Iran hostage crisis and Carter's failed re-election bid ensured that.
You know, no one knew they was going to get stuck out there with the hostages and all that and then lose the election.
While it isn't certain why President Carter declined to meet with the Texas Farm Workers Union marchers, participants have long speculated that United Farm Workers leader César Chávez told him not to.
It does make a certain amount of sense, though, like if you just kind of piece this together contextually.
Historian Timothy Bowman says there is no solid evidence that Chavez reached out to Carter. But he does point out that UFW and AFL-CIO support was a crucial part of the president's base.
Chavez and the UFW and the AFL-CIO supported Carter, right? And a Democratic president in the late 1970s can't afford to alienate a César Chávez.
Whatever the reasons, the Texas farm workers returned home dispirited. But while they did not succeed in gaining an audience with the president, their march raised the profile of the plight of farm workers in the Lone Star State.
So these are from when we were under the UFW. This is ours from the Texas Farm Workers. And then this one's our...
Back in Norma Ramirez's far Texas home, she shows me memorabilia she's laid out in her living room for our interview. Buttons, flags, and newspaper clippings among them.
For that reason. And this was when we were under the early years under César Chávez, or the UFW. I kept them all the year, and I hate to say this, I really don't care for them because of the history, but I feel like, okay, Dad had them, I gotta keep them, you know.
On a table sits a weathered straw hat that I recognize from earlier.
This is my dad's hat, the one he would wear. Okay, I still have it, you see? And then
Norma has become something of the unofficial keeper of the Texas Farm Workers Union history. She's spoken about it at the funerals of her father and leader Antonio Orendain, who died in 2016. I asked her if taking on this impromptu role has been a heavy burden.
No. You know what? What I want is I want this story to be told. I don't want it to die. That is what I want. And to be honest with you, like, I guess like I went through it and everything, so it's not so much as to prepare myself, it's just going back into time. But in my life, this was the best times for me. I mean, this holds my heart.
Campesinos que empezaron a marchar, iban señoras y niños y la Virgen de San Juan.
while traces of the Texas Farm Workers Union story can be found in art, like that piece by Luis Guerra or in Esteban Jordan's songs, what continues to elude its legacy are those more established public fixtures, historical markers, memorials, inclusion in school curriculums. Next time, I'll take a look at how some who are part of the union's history feel it's been intentionally excluded, and what it would mean for them to rectify that. Until then, I am Raul Alonso for the Texas Standard.
Support for Texas Standard comes from the Texas Tuition Promise Fund. For over 10 years, helping families lock in current tuition rates and required fees at Texas public colleges and universities, excluding medical and dental institutions. TexasTuitionPromiseFund.com. Support for Texas Standard comes from the Texas Department of Agriculture, showcasing wild-caught Texas shrimp, sustainably and ethically sourced from Texas's own backyard. Texas Gulf shrimp varieties and recipes at wildcaughttxshrimp.com.
It's the Texas Standard. I'm David Brown. When the Texas Farm Workers Union split from the United Farm Workers in the mid-1970s, they aimed to carry the banner for agricultural labors in the Lone Star State. But only one of the unions is covered in Texas school curriculums or mentioned in state history markers. In this final installment of a three-part series, Texas Standard digital producer Raul Alonso looks at what it would mean to introduce new histories.
Alejandro Rosell, like the children of many farm workers, grew up with his siblings in the fields.
So that's you?
Yes, that's me, Manuela, and my other brother.
His father, Hipólito Rosell, worked primarily as a bricklayer in their hometown of Progreso, Texas. But the allure of the money that could be made from farm work in the Midwest brought the family to Lansing, Michigan, one summer when Alejandro was 4.
At that time, there was no such thing as care for the children, where you can leave them in a certain place and they'll care for you. No, there was no such thing as that. So children were out there in the fields working or playing around.
It was a harmless game until one day.
And I always say, man, that's the race I should have won. But no, my sister was a little bit older and she kind of got ahead of me. And she jumped on the flatbed, but she jumped on the side. And the wheel caught her hip. And I saw all of that, and I remember just freezing there. I couldn't move. And so we transported her to the hospital, and I remember clearly how she kept yelling, "Mom, Ama, Ama." And when they took her inside, they shut the doors, and I didn't hear her anymore. And I knew she was gone. And we never went back.
Alejandro says his sister's death haunted his father for the rest of his life. But when the family returned to Texas, Hipólito met Antonio Orendain, then the head of the Texas UFW, and found an outlet for his grief.
That's what motivated even more for him to go out there and advocate for these people.
A master bricklayer, Hipólito oversaw the construction of the building that became the headquarters for the farm workers. And as a memorial to his daughter Manuela, Hipólito imparted a fixture that still stands at the front of the building, a structure bearing an Aztec eagle, the iconic symbol of the UFW.
And it was in remembrance of his daughter, my sister Manuela. But there was no label. They never actually put any plaque or anything on it. But my dad would always talk about that. He'd always say, that project right there is for my daughter Manuela.
As a kid, Alejandro participated in the Texas Farm Workers Union after the split and even joined their march to Washington, D.C. Now, he's a social studies teacher. He often tells his students stories drawn from his memories.
I bring my stuff, my banner, you know. This is all using the community as a learning tool. And what best real experiences, stories from perhaps their grandparents, their great-great-grandparents.
Alejandro's classes are an outlier. Covering the TFWU is not listed in the curriculum standards for history or Mexican-American studies courses in Texas public schools. But César Chávez and the United Farm Workers are.
And so kids, when they take a test, this state test, the end of the course exam, they see César Chávez. They don't see anybody else other than maybe Dolores Huerta.
While Chavez and the UFW loom large over Latino history in the U.S., much of their actual work was in California. So how did the UFW make it into the Texas curriculum, but Antonio Orendain and the Texas Farm Workers Union did not?
There are a lot of people at the table who have a lot of subject matter expertise that want to inject a lot of different names.
Marissa Perez-Diaz is a Texas State Board of Education member. She says the process for determining who gets included comes down to committee debates.
There are a ton of phenomenal individuals who have been incredible in terms of the contributions they've made to the U.S. But if we put all of those names in, we have to think about what that means for instructional time.
Perez-Diaz says it also comes down to the makeup of board members. She points out she is one of only 2 Latinas setting standards for a K-12 population that's at least 50% Latino.
I think that what happens oftentimes when we're looking at specifically ethnic studies courses is things like the United Farm Workers Union, right? The more national narrative is what's included, right? It was more on a national stage, and so that's a little more, people understand it.
I feel like the Texas UFW, Texas Farm Workers story, it highlights a chapter of this state that a lot of people find fascinating because they don't know it.
Historian Timothy Bowman is currently writing the first book on the TFWU. He says part of the reason the union has been overlooked is that learning about it means getting into some of the more controversial aspects of the history of Chavez and the UFW.
They don't want to remember César Chávez, who was angry or yelled at people or threw people out of the union or whatever.
When the Texas Farm Workers Union and the UFW split, the building Alejandro's father, Hipólito Rosell, helped build became a main point of contention. The 2 unions shared the building under tense circumstances until one day when the TFWU members were forcibly evicted. Today, the building houses the nonprofit that César Chávez and Dolores Huerta founded in San Juan, Texas. The eagle fixture Hipólito built as a memorial to his daughter Manuela is still there. New, however, is a plaque dedicated in 2017 with funding from the Hidalgo County Historical Commission with the seal of the UFW at the top. It talks about the 1966 Starr County strike, the construction of the building, and its transfer to the César Chávez Foundation. It doesn't mention the Texas Farm Workers Union. Alejandro Rosell had seen the plaque from the road, but never stopped to take a look. I asked him if he wanted to read it from a photo I'd taken.
Wow, it's shocking to see that. It's difficult to absorb.
Despite all this, there has been some recognition of the Texas Farm Workers Union. In 2014, the Museum of South Texas History in Edinburgh held a small exhibit of the 1977 march. Leader Antonio Orendain himself was able to view it. A few years later, Orendain's family and other organizers put together a commemorative march to mark the 50th anniversary of the March to D.C. But still, Alejandro and others who carry these memories have yet to achieve some of the lasting monuments, street names, historical plaques. There were also efforts to get a South Texas school named after Orendain, but to no avail. In the years before the leaders of the Texas Farm Workers Union died, Alejandro says they would get together and reminisce on old times.
And they would always tell me, please keep it alive. Don't let it die.
But whether the story of Antonio Orendain and the Texas Farm Workers Union ever finds a permanent place in the popular consciousness, at least in Texas, in the way César Chávez and the United Farm Workers has, remains to be seen. But in the meantime, those that carry the history with them march on. I'm Raul Alonso for the Texas Standard. You can learn more about the stories on today's program by visiting us at texasstandard.org.
And if you'd like to share your own story or let us know what's happening in your part of the Lone Star State, reach out to us at the Contact Us link on our website or on your social media platform of choice. We'd love to hear from you. We'll be back tomorrow. Till then, I'm David Brown on behalf of the entire Texas Standard team, wishing you all the very best from Austin.
Philanthropic support comes from Casey and Scott O'Hare, the Winkler Family Foundation, Lynn Dobson and Greg Wooldridge, Adrian Killam, the George Huntington family, and the Hatton W. Sumners Foundation.